A quiet afternoon at the entrance of the city's government building, a place that should stand for justice and protection, was about to turn into a humiliating nightmare that no one saw coming. The older man shuffled forward, clutching a worn, folded piece of paper he needed to file inside. His steps were slow, showing the weight of years, but his face held a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. Just as he reached the door, he felt an iron grip on his shoulder, jarring him to a sudden stop. Looking up, he found himself staring into the steely gaze of a young officer in uniform, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Where do you think you're going, old man?" the officer said, his voice thick with disdain. "This building's not for everyone. We don't need people like you around here, making the place look untidy." The elderly man's hands trembled, but he steadied himself, looking the officer in the eye, as if to assert, if only silently, his own right to be there. But the officer's smile only grew colder. In a flash, the officer pushed the man back, harder than necessary, sending him stumbling backward. His body hit the ground with a thud, his dignity shattered in front of a few onlookers who either looked away or exchanged glances filled with discomfort. "Stay down, old man," the officer taunted, standing over him, arms crossed. "People like you have no place walking through here as if you belong. Who are you fooling? You're nobody." The old man tried to pull himself up, placing a hand on his knee to regain his balance, but a sudden kick from the officer sent him crashing back down. His face hit the rough pavement, and a sharp pain pulsed through his cheek. He felt humiliated, reduced to the dirt beneath him by someone who should have been sworn to protect him. But it wasn't just physical pain that burned him. It was the deep, searing cut of humiliation and injustice, the sting of being reduced to nothing more than a figure of mockery. The people passing by quickly avoided the scene, some pretending not to notice, others too afraid to speak out, not wanting to risk attracting the officer's fury themselves. The officer leaned down, his voice now barely a whisper. "What, you think you're special? You don't get to walk in here like you own the place. People like you don't have power. You know that, don't you?" He laughed, a low, bitter sound, as he straightened up and kicked the man's walking stick out of reach. "Try getting in now." A passerby finally gathered the courage to intervene. "Hey, isn't that a bit much?" she said, her voice shaking. The officer shot her a glare, and she took a step back, fear evident in her eyes. She wanted to help, but she knew, as everyone else did, that speaking against a uniform in this town came with consequences. The elderly man's vision blurred, both from the physical pain and the weight of the humiliation pressing down on him. In his mind, memories flashed, of working tirelessly, raising a family, building a life, and now, in his twilight years, being reduced to this moment of pure, gut-wrenching shame. He'd come to the government building to address an issue he'd encountered with his property, but now, lying on the ground, that seemed irrelevant. All he wanted was to regain his dignity. The officer smirked, seemingly satisfied with his handiwork. "Maybe next time you'll know your place," he sneered. "Stay out of here. People like you, they're nothing but trouble." The words echoed in the man's mind, cutting deeper than any wound ever could. Just then, another officer passing by called out, seeing the man on the ground and the officer standing over him. "What's going on here?" But one sharp look from the racist officer, coupled with a dismissive shrug, seemed to end the questioning. The passerby looked at the elderly man with sympathy but quickly moved on, afraid of attracting more attention to herself. But as the elderly man lay there, a quiet determination filled his chest. He knew he couldn't let this be the final image of himself, the image of defeat. His heart beat heavily as he slowly, painfully, pulled himself up from the ground, ignoring the biting pain in his joints and muscles. He would walk home with what was left of his pride intact. This moment would not define him. What the officer didn't know, however, was that this nobody he had humiliated was not alone in this town. Not at all. Beneath the worn clothes and the quiet demeanor, this man held a connection that ran deeper in the city than the officer could imagine. And he was about to find out in a way he'd never expect. A quiet, raging fire simmered in the older man's heart as he brushed off the dirt from his clothes, each painful step echoing a lifetime of resilience. He had always taught his family to meet adversity with strength, to respond to injustice with calm but unwavering resolve. But the events of this day had crossed a line. He'd faced discrimination before, yes, but never so openly, so brazenly, in a place meant to uphold fairness and order. As he walked away, the officer watched him with a smirk, muttering something under his breath that made the onlookers cringe. The elderly man ignored him, saving his strength, his gaze fixed forward. Little did the officer know, he had just sparked a series of events that would leave him, and the entire town, stunned. Because this man, who he thought was nothing but a powerless, aging stranger, was about to remind everyone exactly who he was. And he had someone powerful in his corner, someone who would see that justice was served in a way that no one would forget. Soon, whispers started spreading in the town, stories of what had happened that day outside the government building. A rumor reached the sheriff's office, and soon, all eyes were on the officer who had humiliated the elderly man. But this wasn't just any story. This was a story of defiance, of long-awaited justice, and of a reckoning that would shake the very ground on which the officer stood. Who was this man that the officer thought he could shove aside like nothing? And how would the town react when they discovered his true connection to the very heart of the law in this city? A quiet storm was brewing, and the officer's actions would not go unanswered. Stay with us as we dive deeper into this powerful story, filled with a clash between arrogance and quiet strength, between prejudice and dignity, and a twist of fate that will make everyone question how they treat those who seem powerless. Because in this town, power isn't always worn on the sleeve, it runs deep, and it fights back. Hello to everyone watching, especially to our Black audience. At Plow of Twist, we firmly stand against all forms of racism and discrimination. We're committed to sharing stories that shed light on justice, resilience, and respect, reminding us all of the importance of standing up against injustice in every form. Thank you for being here, and we hope you find power and inspiration in today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to stay connected with us for more narratives that challenge, uplift, and make a difference. Enjoy the story. The story unfolded in a small but proud town nestled in the heart of the American Midwest, where the downtown streets were lined with century-old buildings, and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. Despite the rapid modernization sweeping across cities, this town held firm to its traditional values, where respect was paid to those who had grown up there, and generations often stayed close, carrying on the family legacy. Yet, for all its charm and simplicity, the town harbored its shadows, deep-rooted prejudices that lingered stubbornly and, from time to time, showed themselves in small, hurtful ways. In this town, the sheriff was a man named Marcus Hayes, a figure of integrity and dignity, who commanded respect in every corner of the city. Known for his fair and unwavering sense of justice, Marcus had made it his life's work to bring change to the town he had grown up in, a town where his own family had faced countless struggles due to the color of their skin. Marcus was in his early 50s, with the kind of wisdom that came from years of walking the fine line between law and compassion, understanding when to act with strength and when to extend mercy. His commitment to fairness wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For Marcus, the fight for justice wasn't an abstract concept. It was rooted in his own experience and the sacrifices made by his father, Elijah Hayes, a proud and resilient man in his 70s who had seen more than his share of hardship. Elijah had worked tirelessly throughout his life, holding down 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time, to provide for his family. Known around town for his integrity and resilience, Elijah had become something of a silent legend. He was a man who commanded respect, not with words, but with his presence, a steady gaze, a kind smile, and an unbreakable sense of self-worth that had seen him through the many hardships he had endured. Elijah's presence around town was quiet but unmistakable. Despite his age, he was still active, often taking long walks through the familiar streets, greeting old friends and new faces alike. He carried himself with a dignity that was hard to ignore, though he seldom demanded attention. To most, he was just Mr. Hayes, the old-timer with a nod for everyone and a story for those willing to listen. But to those who knew him well, Elijah was a pillar of the community, a man who had spent his life overcoming adversity with grace and teaching his family to do the same. Then there was Officer Trent Miller, a young police officer who had only been with the town's police force for a few years. Trent was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and held a chip on his shoulder that no one could quite place. Some said it was the pressures of being young and in authority, others whispered about his thinly veiled resentment towards certain groups in town. Trent's upbringing had been starkly different from the one Marcus or Elijah had known. Raised in a privileged family, he had never known the struggles or challenges that marked the lives of many in his community, least of all the Hayes family. His perspective was shaped by an upbringing that emphasized entitlement and superiority, a mindset that often found its way into his interactions with others, especially those he deemed beneath him. The town had noticed Officer Miller's behavior, though many chose to look the other way. After all, Trent wasn't outright aggressive, his insults were hidden in glances, his power plays subtle enough to pass as routine policing. But there was an unspoken understanding among some residents, a quiet acknowledgement that, with Trent, the wrong glance or question could lead to an encounter that left people feeling less than human. One autumn afternoon, Elijah Hayes found himself at the town's government building, a place he had visited numerous times over the years, mostly to handle mundane matters like property tax issues and occasionally to check in with Marcus. That day, however, he had come to address an issue with his property, something minor, but important enough for him to take the trip. The air was crisp, and the sky a slate gray, with just a hint of rain threatening to fall, but Elijah moved steadily, his shoulders straight, his face calm. As he approached the entrance, he noticed Officer Miller standing by the door, leaning casually against the wall. Trent's gaze sharpened when he saw Elijah, an almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips as he straightened up, blocking the doorway. "Can I help you, old man?" Trent's voice was laced with thinly veiled disdain, his eyes narrowing as he looked Elijah up and down. Elijah, not one to be intimidated, met Trent's gaze. "Just here to take care of some business," he replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wouldn't be cowed either. Trent let out a low chuckle, crossing his arms. "This building's not for everybody, you know," he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Some people might get the wrong idea, thinking they belong here." Elijah felt a prickle of anger but kept his composure, choosing to ignore the officer's taunt. He attempted to step around Trent, but the younger man moved swiftly, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder and shoving him back, just enough to knock him off balance. "Let's get something straight," Trent said, his voice barely above a whisper but dripping with malice. "People like you don't walk in here like you own the place. You don't get to strut around, making demands." Elijah staggered, catching himself before he fell, and looked up at Trent with a mixture of hurt and defiance. The old man had seen plenty of men like Trent in his life, men who hid their cruelty behind a badge, men who enjoyed asserting power over those they thought powerless. But it didn't make the sting of the insult any less painful. "Look, I'm just here to handle my business," Elijah replied, his voice calm but firm, though he could feel the weight of Trent's eyes boring into him, trying to strip away the dignity he had worked so hard to build. Trent's lips curled into a sneer. "Maybe you need a reminder that people like you don't get special treatment around here," he said, giving Elijah a rough shove that sent him sprawling onto the cold, hard pavement. The fall was harder than Elijah had expected. His body hit the ground with a thud, the concrete scraping his hands and knees. Pain shot through his side, and he felt a sudden wave of dizziness, but more than the physical hurt, it was the humiliation that cut him the deepest. In that moment, the years of resilience, the lessons he had taught his children and grandchildren about dignity and strength, all seemed to fade in the face of this deliberate act of cruelty. Trent leaned over him, his shadow casting a long, dark shape over Elijah's prone form. "Stay down, old man," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "This place isn't for people like you." Remember that. Several people passing by had witnessed the encounter, but no one dared intervene. A few averted their eyes, discomfort evident on their faces, while others shot sympathetic glances at Elijah as he lay there, his pride bruised more than his body. One person even pulled out a phone, but as Trent shot them a cold glare, they quickly put it away, not wanting to attract his attention. Slowly, Elijah pushed himself up, his body protesting with every movement. His hands shook as he dusted off his clothes, his mind reeling from the violation he had just endured. He had always been a man of peace, a man who believed that respect was something to be earned, not forced. But today, in that single, humiliating moment, all of his beliefs about fairness and decency had been tested. Trent watched him with a look of satisfaction, his smirk widening as Elijah finally managed to stand. "Next time, remember your place," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gave one last glance, as if to ensure his message had been received, before he turned and walked back toward the door. Elijah remained where he was for a moment, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. The anger simmered within him, mingling with a profound sadness. He had endured many things in his life, had been called names, had been looked down upon, but this was different. It was a calculated act meant to strip him of his dignity, to remind him of a place he had never chosen for himself. As he walked away from the building, his steps were slower, but his heart beat with a quiet resolve. He had been humiliated, yes, but he would not let that moment define him. And though he did not yet know how, he was certain of one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The community would hear of this, and so would his son, the sheriff, a man who had spent his life fighting for the very respect that had just been stolen from his father. Trent had no idea who he had crossed. The sun was dipping low in the sky when Marcus Hayes, the sheriff of the town, finally returned to his office. The day had been long, filled with back-to-back calls, and his mind was focused on wrapping up before heading home for a quiet evening. But as he settled into his chair, he noticed a missed call from his father, Elijah. Strange, he thought. Elijah usually avoided calling him at work, respecting Marcus's busy schedule. Marcus felt a slight unease settle over him, but he brushed it off, planning to check in with his father once he was off duty. Just as he reached for his phone, however, his deputy, Karen, knocked on his office door, her expression tense. "Marcus, there's something you should know," she said, a hint of urgency in her voice. "What's going on, Karen?" he asked, setting down his paperwork. Karen hesitated, then took a step forward, glancing back at the open door as if she feared someone might overhear. "It's about your father. I've been hearing things from folks in town. Something happened to him at the government building today. I think it involved Officer Miller." A chill ran down Marcus's spine as he processed her words. "What did you hear, exactly?" Karen exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "From what I gather, Miller confronted your dad. Some say he humiliated him. I don't have the whole story, but people are talking, Marcus. And it doesn't sound good." Marcus's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had always suspected that Officer Trent Miller was more than a little rough around the edges, but to involve his father in any kind of humiliation was a line he couldn't ignore. Without another word, Marcus grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his mind racing with thoughts. Elijah wasn't just another resident, he was Marcus's father, a man who had given everything for his family and his community. The idea of anyone, let alone a member of his own team, treating him with anything less than respect was infuriating. As Marcus pulled up to his father's house, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't sure what he'd find inside, but he knew he needed to hear the full story directly from his father. When he knocked on the door, Elijah answered, his face revealing little, though there was a faint bruise on his cheek, a reminder of the day's events. "Marcus," Elijah greeted him with a slight smile, though Marcus could see the fatigue in his eyes. "Dad, I heard something happened today, with Officer Miller." Marcus's voice was steady, but his gaze was searching, watching for any sign of what his father had been through. Elijah sighed, stepping back to let his son into the living room. He moved slowly, easing himself into an armchair, and Marcus noticed the stiffness in his movements, the slight wince as he sat down. "Yes, something did happen," Elijah replied, his tone calm but laced with a hint of bitterness. "That young officer decided I was a little too familiar with the government building for his liking. He thought he'd remind me that people like me don't belong in places like that." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. "What exactly did he do?" Elijah's gaze was steady as he recounted the incident. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing how Trent had blocked his path, shoved him, and ultimately left him on the ground, bruised and humiliated. Marcus listened in silence, the anger within him building with each word. He could feel the weight of his father's pain, the insult to his dignity, and it fueled a rage he hadn't felt in years. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought. I should have done more to keep guys like him out of the force." Elijah shook his head. "It's not your fault, son. This kind of hate, it doesn't come from a badge or a job. It's rooted deep. I've seen it before, and I'll see it again. But what matters is what you do now, how you choose to respond." Marcus nodded slowly, a sense of purpose hardening within him. He wasn't just going to let this slide. His father deserved respect, and Trent Miller would face the consequences of his actions. But he also knew he needed to handle this carefully. One wrong move, and he'd be accused of abusing his power. He'd seen it happen before. "Don't worry, Dad," Marcus said, a determined edge to his voice. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The next day, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his deputies, excluding Trent Miller. The other officers filed into the conference room, exchanging curious glances. Marcus rarely held meetings of this nature, and his serious expression only added to the tension in the room. Once everyone was seated, Marcus stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the edge, his gaze sweeping over the officers. "I've called this meeting because there's something we need to address. Yesterday, my father, Elijah Hayes, was subjected to unacceptable treatment by one of our own, Officer Miller." A murmur rippled through the room as the officers exchanged shocked looks. Karen, who had been in the room the previous night, glanced down, a hint of sadness in her eyes. Marcus continued, his voice firm. "As officers, we're entrusted with the duty to protect and serve every resident of this town, without exception. What happened yesterday was a betrayal of that trust. We can't let personal biases interfere with our duty. This isn't just about my father, this is about respecting the dignity of every person in this town." One of the deputies, Sam, spoke up. "Sheriff, with all due respect, are we sure this is how it went down? Miller's rough, but this is serious." Marcus's gaze was steely as he looked at Sam. "I'm more than sure, Sam. And this isn't the first time we've had complaints about Miller's behavior. This time, it was personal. Next time, it could be one of you, or one of your family members." His voice softened, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. "Imagine if it was someone you loved on the receiving end of that kind of treatment." The room fell silent, a heavy realization settling over the group. Marcus's words hit close to home, reminding each of them of the responsibility they bore and the line that had been crossed. Karen leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet determination. "What are you planning to do, Sheriff?" Marcus straightened, his gaze firm. "I'm planning to make this right. I'll be filing an official report on Officer Miller's conduct, and until further notice, he's off active duty. This behavior can't go unpunished. We owe it to the community, and to my father, to take a stand." The deputies nodded, a sense of unity filling the room. For many, it was a sobering reminder of their duty to the town, a responsibility that went beyond the uniform and the badge. They had pledged to serve and protect, and that pledge extended to every resident, regardless of race, age, or background. When Marcus returned to his office later that day, he found himself staring at the framed photos on his desk, images of his family, his father, his own journey through the years. His father's resilience had always been a guiding force in his life, a reminder of strength in the face of adversity. Now, it was his turn to carry that legacy forward, to show that the values his father had instilled in him were more than just words. As the hours passed, word began to spread through town. People whispered about the incident, about the sheriff's response, and about the uncertain future of Officer Miller. Some supported Marcus's decision, while others questioned whether he was acting out of personal vendetta. The town was divided, caught between loyalty to the sheriff and a fear of disrupting the fragile peace that had held for so long. Late that evening, Marcus's phone rang. It was Elijah. "Marcus," his father said, his voice calm but weary. "I heard what you did today. You didn't have to go to all that trouble." "Dad," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "This isn't just for you. This is for everyone who's ever felt the weight of disrespect. What happened to you, it can't happen again. Not on my watch." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Elijah spoke, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I raised a good man, Marcus. I just hope the town understands that." "They will, Dad," Marcus assured him, though a part of him couldn't ignore the nagging doubts. He knew he was walking a fine line, that his decision could have repercussions. But he also knew that he couldn't let fear guide his actions. He had a duty to uphold the values he had sworn to protect, no matter the cost. As Marcus hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. This wasn't just a simple disciplinary matter. It was a reckoning, a test of the values he had built his career on, a chance to prove that justice wasn't a privilege but a right. The town waited in silence, uncertain and tense, bracing for what would come next. And as Marcus prepared himself for the days ahead, he knew that the real confrontation was still to come, a moment that would either affirm his commitment to justice or unravel the very foundation of trust he had built over the years. In that stillness, a storm was brewing, and the town could feel it, an unspoken anticipation, a sense that things were about to change, that a truth long buried was about to come to light. Marcus Hayes entered the station early that morning, his face set in a determined expression. He had slept little, his mind turning over the events of the past days, the pain and humiliation his father had endured, and the plan he had carefully set into motion. Today was the day when the entire town, and, most importantly, Officer Trent Miller, would face the consequences of what had transpired. The station was quieter than usual, the air heavy with anticipation. Word had spread quickly among the officers, and the atmosphere was charged, as if everyone was bracing for a storm. Marcus walked purposefully to his office, calling for a meeting with his top deputies. He needed his team to stand with him, to understand that what they were about to do went beyond a simple act of discipline, it was a statement about the values their badge represented. Within minutes, the small conference room was filled with Marcus's most trusted deputies, each one glancing at the sheriff with a mix of respect and curiosity. Karen, seated near the front, watched Marcus intently, sensing the gravity of the moment. She knew Marcus's struggle was deeply personal, yet she also recognized his unyielding commitment to fairness. Marcus looked around the room, his gaze steady. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm but firm. "What happened between Officer Miller and my father wasn't just an unfortunate incident. It was a betrayal of everything we stand for as a department. And it's something we're not going to let slide." A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what Marcus had planned. Sam, one of the younger deputies, spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Sheriff, we all respect Mr. Hayes, but Miller's popular with some folks in town. There might be backlash." Marcus's expression didn't waver. "I understand that. But if we're going to wear this badge, we can't let personal connections dictate our actions. Today, we're going to make it clear that abuse of power won't be tolerated, by anyone." The officers fell silent, a new sense of resolve settling over them as they absorbed Marcus's words. Each of them understood the weight of their actions and the significance of the day that lay ahead. After dismissing the team, Marcus remained in the conference room, alone with his thoughts. He had instructed Karen to call Trent in for a routine debriefing later that morning. It was a delicate situation, one wrong move, and he knew things could spiral out of control. But he was ready, his resolve as firm as ever. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, Trent arrived at the station, oblivious to the tension that awaited him. He strode confidently down the hall, a slight smirk on his face as he passed by some of his fellow officers. To Trent, the events of the previous day were already fading in his mind. He viewed his actions as just another day of keeping order, a necessary part of his duty. Little did he know, his life was about to change dramatically. He pushed open the door to the conference room, stopping in his tracks when he saw Marcus sitting at the head of the table, flanked by several of the department's highest-ranking officers. The atmosphere was charged, an intensity in the air that immediately set him on edge. "Take a seat, Officer Miller," Marcus said, his tone calm but authoritative. Trent hesitated for a moment before pulling out a chair. He leaned back casually, attempting to mask his unease with a look of indifference. "What's this all about, Sheriff?" Marcus clasped his hands together, his gaze piercing. "This is about your actions yesterday. About the way you treated my father, and the way you've conducted yourself in this department." Trent's smirk faltered, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. "With all due respect, Sheriff, your father was out of line. He was obstructing the entrance, and I was just doing my job." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Doing your job? By shoving an elderly man to the ground? By humiliating him in front of onlookers?" Trent shrugged, his posture tense. "Look, I don't have to justify myself. He was out of line. I did what needed to be done." The other officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Marcus took a deep breath, controlling the anger that simmered just below the surface. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice measured, "this isn't about justifying anything. It's about accountability. My father wasn't obstructing anything. You know that as well as I do. What you did was an abuse of power, plain and simple." Trent's jaw clenched, a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. "I don't see how this is any of your business, Sheriff. If he wasn't your father, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Marcus's expression hardened. "You're right, Trent. If it were anyone else, this would have been addressed long ago. But you've taken advantage of this department's leniency, and that ends today." Trent laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "So, this is about punishing me? Over a harmless shove?" "It wasn't harmless," Marcus replied, his tone sharp. "It was deliberate. And it wasn't just a shove. It was a show of disrespect, a message you wanted to send to an old man because you thought no one would care. But you were wrong. People do care, Trent. And they're watching." Trent scoffed, shifting in his seat. "You think anyone outside this room cares about some old man falling over? You think anyone's going to side with you over a fellow officer?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about sides, Trent. This is about justice. And in this department, we uphold justice, regardless of who's involved." A tense silence filled the room as Trent glared at Marcus, a mix of anger and resentment in his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus held up a hand. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct, Officer Miller," he continued, his voice firm. "This incident with my father is just the latest. You've bullied, intimidated, and mistreated citizens who are supposed to feel safe under our protection." Trent's face flushed with anger. "You don't know what it's like out there, Sheriff. These people, they think they can just walk all over us. Someone has to put them in their place." Karen, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her tone sharp. "Putting people in their place? Is that what you think your job is?" Trent turned to her, his expression defiant. "You're all too soft. People need to understand that we're the authority around here. If they don't respect us, we make them respect us." Marcus shook his head, a look of disappointment in his eyes. "Respect isn't something you can force, Trent. It's something you earn. And you've done nothing to earn the respect of this community." Trent's gaze flickered with unease, his bravado beginning to waver. "So, what now? You're going to fire me over this?" Marcus held his gaze, his voice steady. "Your actions have consequences, Trent. Effective immediately, you're suspended from duty. There will be a formal investigation, and if we find any further evidence of misconduct, you'll be dismissed." Trent's face twisted with fury, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you can just throw me out? After everything I've done for this town?" Marcus's expression was calm, resolute. "What you've done for this town? Trent, your job was to serve this community, to protect its residents, not to act as judge and jury. This isn't about you. It's about the people you've hurt, the people you've disrespected." Trent stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a setup. You're only doing this because he's your father. This isn't justice. This is personal." Marcus rose to his feet as well, his gaze locked on Trent. "You're right, Trent. It is personal. But not in the way you think. This is personal because I've dedicated my life to this job, to this town, to the values that this badge represents. And I won't let anyone, especially someone wearing the same badge, tear those values down." A tense silence settled over the room as the weight of Marcus's words sank in. Trent's face was flushed with anger, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. But he could see the resolve in Marcus's eyes, the determination in the faces of the deputies around him. He knew he was outnumbered, that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. Without another word, Trent stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the station, a bitter reminder of the confrontation that had just taken place. Marcus stood there for a moment, his shoulders tense, the gravity of the situation settling over him. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the real challenges lay ahead. But he also knew that he had done the right thing, that he had stood up for what he believed in, even when it meant confronting a fellow officer. Turning to his deputies, Marcus let out a slow breath, the weight of his decision heavy but necessary. "Thank you all," he said quietly, "for standing with me. Today, we reminded this town, and ourselves, that we're here to protect everyone. No exceptions." The deputies nodded, a quiet respect in their eyes as they left the room one by one, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The day had settled into an uneasy calm at the station. After Trent's explosive exit, Marcus Hayes returned to his office, feeling the weight of the decision he'd made. The confrontation had been a necessary stand, but he knew the fallout would be difficult, not only for him but for the department and the town. News of Trent's suspension spread quickly, and the station was buzzing with whispers as officers tried to make sense of what had just happened. Meanwhile, Trent was nowhere to be found. Rumors circulated that he had gone to a bar on the edge of town, drowning his anger in cheap whiskey, but Marcus didn't need confirmation to know that Trent was out there, fuming, plotting his next move. Marcus knew Trent too well. He was a man who couldn't accept failure, especially not at the hands of someone he saw as his superior only in title, not in character. As evening settled over the town, Marcus was preparing to leave for the day when he heard a knock on his office door. He looked up, surprised to see his father, Elijah, standing in the doorway, his face marked by a quiet resolve. "Dad," Marcus said, standing to greet him. "What are you doing here? You didn't have to come all the way down." Elijah stepped inside, giving his son a faint smile. "I came because I had to see you. And because there's something I need to say." Marcus gestured for his father to sit down, sensing the weight behind his words. Elijah settled into the chair across from him, resting his hands on the armrests, his gaze steady but tired. "You did what you had to do, Marcus," Elijah said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. But I want to make sure that you're doing this for the right reasons. Not just for me, or even for this town. I need you to be doing this for yourself, because that's the only way this change will mean anything. Marcus nodded slowly, the depth of his father's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. I know, Dad. I've thought about that a lot these past few days. And I want you to know, this isn't just about you. It's about everything you taught me, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Elijah's gaze softened. I see that, son. And I'm proud of you. I always have been. But this fight, it's bigger than you and me. It's about a whole community that's been ignored and disrespected for too long. You're their voice now, and that comes with a responsibility. You can't take this lightly. Marcus felt the weight of his father's words. He had always known the burden of leadership, but now, faced with the consequences of his decision, he felt it in a way he never had before. I understand, Dad. I'll keep fighting for what's right. But I can't do it alone. I need you to stand with me, to be the strength that keeps me going, Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. Elijah nodded, reaching across the desk to place a hand on his son's. I've always been with you, Marcus. And I always will be. You come from a line of strong people, people who faced worse than this and came out stronger. Don't let anyone take that from you. Just then, the sound of a commotion in the hallway outside Marcus's office broke the moment. The voices were muffled, but there was a distinct edge of anger in the air. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Elijah before standing up and opening the door to see what was going on. In the hallway stood Trent Miller, visibly intoxicated, his face flushed with anger and defiance. Several officers had gathered, looking on with varying degrees of unease as Trent confronted them, his words slurred but venomous. Where's the sheriff? Trent demanded, his gaze wild. I want to talk to him. Right now. Marcus stepped forward, his presence immediately silencing the murmurs. Trent, he said firmly, keeping his voice steady. You're in no condition to be here. Go home. Trent laughed bitterly, a harsh, empty sound. Home. You think I'm just gonna go home and pretend that you didn't humiliate me today? You're out of your mind, Hayes. The crowd of officers exchanged glances, tension thickening the air as they watched the confrontation unfold. Trent's fists were clenched, his entire body vibrating with rage. You think you're better than me? Trent spat, his voice laced with contempt. Just because you wear that badge, you think you can judge me? You think you have the right? Marcus held Trent's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. This isn't about me being better than anyone, Trent. It's about upholding the values that we all swore to protect. Values? Trent scoffed, a sneer twisting his features. Your values are just a cover, a nice little speech you give to make yourself feel superior. But we both know you're just another man who thinks he can use his power however he wants. Marcus took a steadying breath, refusing to let Trent's taunts provoke him. Trent, you're out of line. This is your last warning, go home, or I'll have to call in disciplinary action. Trent took a step closer, his face inches from Marcus's. I don't care about your warnings, Hayes. You think you can make a fool of me in front of everyone, strip me of my position, and just walk away? You're wrong. Elijah stepped forward, his calm presence commanding attention. Young man, he said, his voice firm, you're only making this worse for yourself. Don't let anger be the thing that defines you. Trent turned to Elijah, his gaze filled with scorn. And what do you know about being defined by anything? You're just an old man who thinks he deserves respect for no reason. Elijah's gaze didn't waver, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. Respect is earned, son. And it's clear you don't understand what that means. That's why you're here, lashing out instead of listening. Trent's face twisted with rage, and for a brief, tense moment, Marcus wondered if he would lash out physically. But then, something in Trent's gaze shifted, a flicker of doubt creeping in as he stared at Elijah's unyielding expression. "Go home, Trent," Marcus said quietly. "This is over. You've made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Trent's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his actions finally pressing down on him. He looked from Marcus to Elijah, the anger in his eyes slowly fading into something closer to resignation. With a muttered curse, he turned and stormed out of the building, leaving the gathered officers to exchange looks of relief and apprehension. As the tension began to dissipate, Marcus turned to his father, his gaze filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," he said quietly. "For being here. For standing by me." Elijah smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I told you, Marcus, I'm always with you. And you did the right thing today, no matter what anyone else thinks. You stood up for what's right, and that's all that matters." Marcus nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. He knew that the days ahead would be challenging, that the community would be watching him closely, waiting to see if he would stand by his convictions. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that he had the strength of his father, and the support of those who believed in justice, to guide him. As they left the station together, father and son, the quiet resolve between them was a testament to the power of resilience, a reminder that, even in the face of adversity, the strength of one's character was the greatest weapon of all. The dust from Trent's explosive exit hadn't settled before the entire town buzzed with stories of what had happened. News of the confrontation between Marcus and Trent spread quickly, fueling debates in cafes, on sidewalks, and around family dinner tables. Some people were surprised that the sheriff had finally taken action against one of his own, while others questioned if it had been a personal vendetta, driven by the incident with Elijah. Regardless of opinion, one thing was certain: the community was now fully invested in the unfolding drama. The morning after the confrontation, Marcus arrived at the station early, feeling the weight of his responsibility more than ever. He knew that his actions had exposed a rift within the town, one that would take more than his position as sheriff to mend. The path ahead was uncertain, and he couldn't shake the awareness that this situation was about more than just Trent, it was about the values and identity of the entire community. Marcus sat in his office, the quiet stillness surrounding him as he reviewed the official report on Trent's suspension. As he read through the document, he couldn't help but think about the broader implications of his decision. Trent's behavior was not unique to him alone, it was the product of an environment that had long fostered divisions and allowed biases to go unchecked. For years, Marcus had believed that, through quiet leadership, he could bring gradual change to the town. But now, he wondered if his approach had been too passive, if he had ignored the signs that a more assertive stand was necessary. A soft knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. It was Karen, looking tired but determined. She stepped into the office, closing the door behind her before speaking. "Sheriff, there's been a lot of talk around town," she said, her voice low. "People are divided. Some are saying you did the right thing, but others think you're abusing your power." Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting out a sigh. "I figured as much. This was never going to be easy, Karen. But it had to be done." Karen nodded, her expression filled with empathy. "I know. And most of us here support you, Marcus. But there's something else you should know. I heard that Trent has been meeting with a few of the town council members. Rumor is, he's trying to rally them against you, saying that your actions are driven by personal bias." Marcus's face hardened, his jaw tightening. He had anticipated that Trent might push back, but hearing that he was actively working to undermine him with the council hit closer to home. The town council had the authority to review his actions as sheriff, and if Trent succeeded in convincing them of his version of events, Marcus knew his career, and his father's dignity, could be further dragged through the mud. "Thank you for telling me, Karen," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I expected resistance, but Trent going to the council, it's a dangerous move. He's not just trying to save face, he's trying to ruin everything we've worked for." Karen placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Marcus. We know what kind of man you are. The truth will come out. You've built a strong foundation in this town, and people see that. They see your integrity." But despite her words, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The council's review process was fair, but it could be swayed by public opinion. Trent was clever and manipulative, and Marcus knew that, even if he couldn't sway the council, he could still turn a significant portion of the town against him. As Marcus considered his next steps, a deep-rooted question arose within him, a moral dilemma he had to confront. Should he wait for the process to play out, trusting that justice would prevail? Or should he take matters into his own hands, risking his reputation and position to ensure that Trent was held accountable? His dedication to the law and his sense of duty clashed with his desire to protect his father's dignity, to finally put an end to Trent's pattern of abuse. The internal struggle gnawed at Marcus, testing his principles in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had always believed that justice was a steady, unwavering path, but now, faced with the reality of Trent's retaliation, he questioned whether his adherence to protocol would ultimately serve the greater good or leave the door open for further harm. Karen interrupted his thoughts again, her voice softer this time. "Marcus, there's something else. People in town are organizing a gathering. They want to show support for you and your father. They're planning to march to the council building this afternoon." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "A march? For us?" Karen nodded. "Yes. They're calling it a march for dignity. I think they want to make a statement that this town won't tolerate what happened to your father, or to anyone else who's been treated unfairly." A flood of emotions washed over Marcus, gratitude, humility, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The people he had spent his life serving were now standing up for him and his father, for the principles he had tried to uphold. But he also knew that this could add fuel to the fire, that the council might see this as a direct challenge to their authority. Later that day, Marcus stood outside the station, watching as people began to gather in the town square. Men and women of all ages, families, young children holding signs, and even a few elderly residents, all coming together, united by a shared purpose. The sight was both humbling and powerful, a visible reminder of the values that had guided his work all these years. Just as he was about to join the crowd, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his father, Elijah, standing beside him, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "I didn't expect this, Dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "All these people, they're here for you, for us." Elijah placed a steady hand on his son's arm, his voice filled with wisdom. "They're here for what's right, Marcus. For too long, we've been quiet, hoping things would change on their own. But sometimes, it takes more than patience. Sometimes, we have to stand together and make sure our voices are heard." As they joined the crowd, Elijah nodded toward the council building in the distance. "Today, we show them that we won't accept being silenced. Not anymore." The crowd began to move forward, chanting words of unity and respect, their voices echoing through the town's quiet streets. Marcus felt a surge of strength as he walked beside his father, the support of the community bolstering his resolve. He knew that, no matter the outcome, this day would be a turning point, a moment when the people of this town came together to stand for justice, for dignity, for each other. When they reached the council building, the crowd filled the square outside, their collective presence impossible to ignore. The town council members peered out of their windows, watching as the citizens they served gathered to make their voices heard. After a few moments, one of the council members, a man named Mr. Franklin, stepped out onto the building's front steps, raising his hands to calm the crowd. He was a respected figure in the town, known for his fair-mindedness and his dedication to maintaining peace. "Sheriff Hayes," Mr. Franklin called, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Would you come forward and speak?" Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding as he faced the gathered citizens and the council members looking down from the steps. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear. "This isn't just about me, or even about my father. This is about all of us, about what kind of community we want to be. Yesterday, I took a stand against someone in our own department, someone who had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. And I know that decision has sparked a lot of discussions, some of them difficult." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, seeing faces filled with hope, concern, and determination. "I know that not everyone agrees with what I did. And I respect that. But I believe that, as sheriff, it's my duty to protect and respect every member of this community. To ensure that everyone, regardless of who they are, is treated with dignity. That's a commitment I've made to all of you." Mr. Franklin nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "Sheriff Hayes, you've taken a stand that's certainly controversial. Some believe it was the right thing to do, others feel it may have been motivated by personal reasons. How do you respond to those who question your motives?" Marcus met Mr. Franklin's gaze, his voice unwavering. "I understand those concerns, Mr. Franklin. And I accept that not everyone will agree with my decision. But I want to assure you, and everyone here, that this was not an act of revenge. It was a matter of principle. If I had turned a blind eye, I would have been failing my duty as sheriff. And I would have been failing all of you." The crowd murmured their agreement, a sense of unity rippling through them as they listened to Marcus's words. After a brief silence, Mr. Franklin spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "Your father's experience is a reminder of the challenges we still face, the work we have yet to do. We appreciate the dedication you've shown to this community, Sheriff Hayes. And I believe that, with the support of everyone here, we can begin to rebuild trust and address these issues together." As the council members stepped back inside, Marcus turned to his father, his heart filled with gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. Elijah gave him a proud nod, and together, they rejoined the community that had rallied around them, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following the march were tense but filled with hope. The town council met to review Marcus's actions formally, but the overwhelming show of support from the community had left a lasting impact. The council acknowledged that Marcus's decision was justified, reinforcing the message that the sheriff's duty was to uphold justice without exception. The council's approval confirmed that the people's voices had been heard, strengthening Marcus's standing in the community and, most importantly, reaffirming his commitment to fairness. As for Trent, his fate was sealed. The investigation revealed a history of complaints that had gone unaddressed, and his behavior towards Elijah was the final straw. He was formally dismissed from the department, stripped of his badge and his power. Word spread quickly, and Trent found himself isolated in the very town he had once tried to control. Without the authority of his badge, he was left to face the reality of his actions, the consequences of his abuse of power clear in every encounter he had with the townsfolk. People avoided him, no longer willing to overlook his behavior. In time, Trent left town, forced to start over, carrying the weight of his actions as a reminder of what he'd lost. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his work as sheriff with renewed purpose. The ordeal had tested him, but it had also brought him closer to the community he served. The citizens now saw him not only as their sheriff but as a man willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. He took on his duties with a renewed sense of commitment, creating programs within the department focused on accountability and community outreach. He wanted to ensure that the issues Trent represented were addressed, that no one would feel the kind of fear and humiliation his father had endured. The community responded with gratitude, their trust in him deepening with each action he took. Elijah, too, found peace in the wake of the ordeal. The support he received from the town filled him with pride, and the respect that people showed him brought a new sense of belonging. The days of silent endurance had ended, and in their place was a newfound understanding that he was valued, that his life and experiences mattered deeply to the people around him. He spent his days walking through town as he always had, but now, those walks were accompanied by nods and greetings from strangers and friends alike, their gestures a testament to the quiet strength he had shown. For Elijah, it was a form of justice he had never expected but deeply appreciated. One evening, Marcus and Elijah met at their usual spot in the town square, where a statue of the town's founders stood as a reminder of history. The square was quiet, the streetlights casting a warm glow over the benches and trees that lined the path. Marcus looked over at his father, his heart filled with gratitude for the lessons Elijah had taught him, the quiet strength he had modeled all these years. "You know, Dad," Marcus began, his voice soft, "all my life, you taught me about respect, about dignity. I thought I understood, but, this past month, it's become so much clearer." Elijah nodded, a knowing smile touching his lips. "It was never an easy path, Marcus. But you walked it the right way. That's all a father could ask for." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of recent events settling like a peaceful acknowledgement of all they had endured. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that he had honored his father, that he had upheld the values they both held dear. And as he looked around at the town he had sworn to protect, he felt a quiet pride in what they had accomplished together. Days turned into weeks, and life in the town resumed its steady rhythm. But a subtle change had taken root. People looked out for one another a little more closely, and there was a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. The ordeal with Trent had become a turning point, a moment of reckoning that had brought the town together. Marcus saw it in the way people greeted each other on the street, in the way they approached him with a newfound respect, their trust in him evident in every interaction. The sheriff's department underwent changes as well. Under Marcus's leadership, they implemented community feedback sessions, giving residents a voice in their policing. New officers were recruited with a strong emphasis on empathy and respect for all citizens, and training sessions on cultural sensitivity became mandatory. Marcus was determined that his father's experience would not be in vain, it would be a catalyst for a better, fairer system. On the anniversary of the march, the town held a gathering in the square. People from all walks of life came together to celebrate the progress they had made, to honor the values of respect and justice that they had embraced as a community. Elijah stood beside Marcus as the crowd gathered around, their presence a symbol of resilience and hope. Marcus spoke briefly, expressing his gratitude for the town's support and his commitment to continue serving with integrity. Elijah, too, offered a few words, his voice strong as he thanked the community for standing by him and his family. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus felt a deep sense of closure. He knew that the journey would continue, that there would always be challenges to face. But he also knew that he was not alone, that the community stood with him. The experience had strengthened them all, binding them together in a way that could never be undone. This story, at its heart, is about justice, respect, and the strength of community. It reminds us that sometimes, standing up for what's right means facing uncomfortable truths and confronting those who misuse their power. But it also shows us the power of resilience, the quiet, steadfast strength that can change lives and inspire those around us. Have you ever felt that inner conflict between doing what's easy and doing what's right? It's a struggle many of us face, and this story asks us to reflect on what it truly means to serve and respect others. In our own lives, we have the power to make a difference, to stand up when it matters most, even if that means going against the grain. What did this story make you feel? What lessons or thoughts did it bring to mind for you? We'd love to hear your reflections. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of our community, and we want to know how this story resonated with you. Thank you for joining us today on Tales of Twist. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking tales, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next story, where every twist reveals a new truth.